So what happens when a potential war crime, widespread incompetence, and some really extreme ideology all start to converge inside a single government? Well, in this explainer, we're going to break down historian Heather Cox Richardson's analysis of how these forces might just be creating a nation at a tipping point.
The entire story, at least as Heather Cox Richardson lays it out, really starts with just two words: kill everybody. This alleged order, which she reports came from the then Defense Secretary, Pete Hegseth, is this shocking moment that she says is really the doorway to a much, much bigger crisis.
Now, according to Heather Cox Richardson, this isn't just some isolated, alarming incident. No, she argues it's actually a symptom of a much deeper fight for the very control of the government. She connects this one moment to a whole narrative of lawlessness and extremist thinking that's starting to take hold.
Okay, so let's follow that first thread she points out. Heather Cox Richardson identifies an act so serious that, as she notes, legal experts have flat out called it a war crime.
To really get the gravity of this, we've got to understand what a double tap strike actually is. It is a brutal, two-stage attack. You have an initial strike, and then it's followed by a second one right on the same spot. Now, that second strike often hits survivors and first responders, and that is precisely why, as Heather Cox Richardson notes, it's widely considered an illegal war crime.
So here's the timeline of that September 2nd incident, which Heather Cox Richardson pulls from reporting in the Washington Post. You can just follow the chain of events. First, there's the initial missile strike on a small boat. Then, and this is crucial, survivors are spotted in the water. It's at that moment that Secretary Hegseth allegedly gives the order, kill everybody, which leads directly to that second fatal strike.
And as Heather Cox Richardson points out, the backlash was immediate, and it came from both sides of the aisle. I mean, you see the names here from across the political spectrum. You've got key Republican committee chairs like Mike Rogers in the House and Roger Wicker in the Senate, promising investigations right away. That tells you this wasn't about politics. It was about a fundamental breach of conduct.
So what was the administration's response? Well, Heather Cox Richardson highlights this quote. Instead of talking about the order, Secretary Hegseth deflected. He publicly backed the on-scene commander, Admiral Bradley. As she suggests, it's a classic way to shift the focus away from the chain of command, but it really didn't do much to calm things down.
And this brings us right to the second thread in Heather Cox Richardson's analysis. She connects this potential lawlessness to an even broader theme, what she sees as just a stunning display of incompetence at the highest levels of government.
Heather Cox Richardson uses a televised cabinet meeting as a perfect example of this dysfunction. The meeting was supposed to project strength and control, right? But the reality that was broadcast to the world was, well, the president appearing to be asleep. It was a visual that completely undermined that message of competence they were going for.
And this feeling of chaos, it wasn't just at the Pentagon. Heather Cox Richardson also brings up a leaked report from inside the FBI, and get this quote, active duty agents were describing their own agency as a rudderless ship. I mean, that paints a pretty stark picture of deep institutional turmoil.
Heather Cox Richardson then points to the president's statements on the economy. At a time when a lot of Americans were really struggling with rising prices, he just dismissed the whole idea of affordability as a Democrat scam. For her, this just shows a massive disconnect from the day-to-day reality that so many people were living.
And that leads us to the third and final thread that Heather Cox Richardson pulls on, that scary moment when dangerous rhetoric stops being just words and becomes actual government policy.
Heather Cox Richardson really zeroes in on the dehumanizing language the president used when he talked about immigration. She argues that calling people garbage, like in this quote, isn't just talk. It's laying the groundwork for what's about to happen with policy.
And right here, you can see exactly how Heather Cox Richardson connects the dots. It's a straight line from words to action. It starts with that dehumanizing rhetoric, which then becomes official policy, like pausing applications from 19 different countries, and then it leads to targeting specific communities right here at home. So why is that specific targeting in Minneapolis-St. Paul so important? Well, this number is the reason why. Heather Cox Richardson points out that 95% of Somalis in Minnesota are already U.S. citizens, so the planned sweeps weren't really about recent immigrants, they were targeting American citizens. So in her conclusion, Heather Cox Richardson pulls all three of these threads, the lawlessness, the incompetence, and the ideology, together. She argues they aren't separate problems at all. Instead, they're converging, almost like a perfect storm, and creating a nation at a really critical moment. To really capture how serious the situation is, Heather Cox Richardson actually turns to a pretty surprising source, the conservative columnist George Will, who called the administration a moral slum. And the fact that this criticism came from a longtime conservative, not a political opponent, really underscores for her just how deep the concern had become.
So when you put it all together, the picture Heather Cox Richardson paints is not one of a few isolated incidents. It's a much larger, destabilizing pattern. From the top of the military to the nation's top law enforcement agency, all the way to our national immigration policy, she sees a system that is in deep, profound disarray.
And so Heather Cox Richardson's analysis leaves us all with one final, pretty urgent question. She doesn't give us an easy answer. Instead, she kind of puts it back on us to think about the consequences for the country. What does happen when lawlessness, incompetence, and ideology all crash together at the same time? That's the tipping point she asks us to think about.